A little while ago, someone commented under my supersonic jet video and suggested I try making an A-10 Warthog. I like this idea so much that I wanted to also try making a functional engine to at least partially power it. Ideally, it would do all of this with braking mode turned off, so this will be quite the challenge. Starting out in the sandbox though, you can see the first thing I'm doing here is putting down a swivel joint, and I put down a couple of ballasts on that. Now I put down another swivel joint on that, and you can see here I'm able to spin it around, and this is the very basic start of my engine. This is going to work as my crankshaft, and next up, I was going to need some way to power it. Now, I was thinking here I could use a spring and attach it right to that top swivel joint. With this, you can see here, I actually am able to move it back and forth a little bit, but with just one cylinder, I really wasn't able to spin this all the way around. So of course, next here, you can see what I'm doing is adding in another ballast and adding in another spring. With this, I have two cylinders, and I'm at least somewhat able to start spinning it around. It's a little rough, but overall, this isn't half bad. Now, at this point, some of you may have noticed that the engine design I'm going for is actually a radial engine. Now, the reason for that is that these things can be pretty compact, and you can see here with 4 pistons to get this nice movement all the way around. Now, already, I was actually pretty happy with this, but for a little bit more power and consistency, I wanted to add on 4 more springs. This was where things started to get a little difficult, though, because while it was working very well sometimes, since I manually had to move around all of these springs, it's actually a little tricky to figure out how to get it to go in a circle. And of course, in the final engine, I don't want to have to manually spin it around, so to get the timings right, you can see here, adding in a ballast, and I'm adding in sensors on all of the pistons. The plan here is that the sensors are going to see the ballast in front of them, and then tell the spring to pull in at the right time. This seemed simple enough, and you can see now I'm setting up all the springs for this. Trying it out though, while there was a little bit of movement, it just seemed to kind of bind up a lot, and I thought that part of the problem might be that the engine needs a flywheel. This is going to keep it spinning around, and hopefully stop it from being able to just completely halt immediately. Now, after building that up with sticks here, I wanted to give it a test, but I had a lot of problems where it would just instantly shatter and not really hold on. Now, at this point, I didn't really think the sensors were going to work out, and instead, I had a slightly different idea. You can see now I'm adding in some more ballasts again, and this is for 2 reasons. The first one is to balance out the engine a bit better, and also give it a flywheel. The second reason, though, is that it gives me a platform to put on some angle meters. These are going to see where in the rotation I am, and they're going to pull in the correct spring. You can see here, I'm adding those in now, and once I got those in place, I also need to add in 4 logic gates and set them to all be inverters. The reason those are important is that they're going to make sure that one spring is going to be pulling in while the other is releasing. Now, before, the sensors all had lights on them, which made it easy to see which spring was pulling in, but since that's a little difficult now, I decided to add in some pistons, and any piston that's extended means that the spring below it is contracting. Given this a test now, it was sort of starting to move, but I couldn't really see any real pattern with the pistons, and I was a little concerned that the timings were wrong. One other thing I had realized though is that the entire crankshaft is bending a lot, and as the springs pull on it, it seems to cause a lot of stress. Now, I wanted to try getting rid of that next, and you can see here I tried bracing everything together, and while I did have the same problem, I did get part of rotation out of this, and it was looking a little bit better. This gave me the idea though to try adding in another swivel joint on top to ideally give it a bit more rigidity. Now, I had to link it up with braces, which I really didn't want to do, but you can see here it actually is rotating and it seems to be working almost perfectly. The problem though is that braces have an extremely high resistance to rotation, and this engine is quite a bit more inefficient now. After a little bit more thinking though, I realized I could delete off the swivel joint and replace it with a powered wheel. You can see already this thing's going quite a bit faster, but the powered wheel is a weird quirk where eventually it just totally stops. Fortunately though, the unpowered wheel is also the same size, and this seemed to work the same way, but it didn't stop. And now with this, I actually have a functioning engine, and it really didn't look too bad at all. I was concerned it was going to be pretty weak though, because there's only 8 springs on this, which really isn't that much. Now, to hopefully fix that, you can see here I'm trying to copy my springs over to the side, and I'm rebuilding the engine so I can copy over the springs again. After deleting off all those ballasts, you can see here I'm able to mirror up the springs and attach them to the other side. With this, I got this funny looking pattern, but now I have 16 springs pulling instead of 8. That gives me a lot more consistent power, and I was also moving quite a bit faster. Now, I did this 2 more times, and after copying these in, I now had 32 springs, and I get an even more tight pattern. Now, I also left some springs off to the side that I wasn't using, and for whatever reason, they just started to fill my screen like this, but besides that, this was looking pretty good. I did want to test it with a load, though, and see how it would react once I added on some propellers. So you can see now I added on a wood log, and I put down 4 propellers. Trying this out, it seemed to spin them up fine, and almost with no resistance. Now, I tried this again, and I'm using 8 propellers, and I also rotate rotated them up to be a lot more resistive, but this still seemed to work out really well, and I was pretty optimistic now that it should be able to drive the plane. Before that though, I wanted to put this on a car and just see how much power I'd be generating. Now eventually I was going to convert this car into the plane, but just as a very basic start platform, this seemed like a good way to go. And you can see now it's able to move it forward relatively well. It was a little slow though, and I was hoping to get it more around like 15 meters per second. To do that, the first thing I was thinking was doubling up the propellers. This seemed like an easy way to go, and I also braced the front of the propellers to make them a little more rigid. This was a good start, and I gained a little bit of speed, but I was still a little short of the mark I was trying to hit. Now to get more speed, the next thing I was thinking here was to add on another engine. This I'll attach directly into the output shaft of the first engine, and theoretically, it is going to give me double the power. Trying this out, though, was a little difficult to get these to link together properly, and I also realized I may as well add on a third engine if I'm going this far anyway. With all this, though, you can see I braced up the back of the engines together, and now I wanted to try giving it a test. This was pretty good, but I could see here that the propeller is spinning up quite infrequently, and it seemed like it could really do with a flywheel. Adding this on, I actually managed to tear the engine apart, but at the very least, it did seem to smooth out the motion quite a bit. I had realized, though, instead of a flywheel, more propellers actually wouldn't be a bad way to go here, and if I add them to the back, it balances out the load a lot better. With this, I also got this cool turbine look, which was exactly what I was going for anyway. And while this was working pretty well, it was also really heavy, and I realized that on the full plane, this is gonna be a bit much. Leading off those extra engines here, while it was performing worse, it wasn't all that much worse, and it seems like running with less engines is gonna be a good way to go here. At this point though, it seemed like using 2 engines and using that turbine design was gonna get me the most amount of power, so I decided to revert back to that here, and once I had that in place, you'll also notice him copying over the engine. At this point, I was looking to start construction of the plane, and you can see now I'm starting to use some braces to hold this all together. Now my plan is to make the second engine rotate in the opposite direction of the first one to cancel out the torque. Now you can also see here, I'm deleting off all of my wood car platform and starting to brace this up just like I would on a real plane. After that, you can see I added on some propellers, and I'm starting to build up that turbine just like I had it before. But finally now with the engine built, it's time to start working on the body of the plane, and the first thing I wanted to work on was the tail section. This was probably one of the easier things to work on at the moment, and you can see here I started by building one of the vertical stabilizers. Once I got that built here, I copied the logs that was on and moved it to the other side, and with all that, I wanted to work on the fuselage. This, in contrast, is probably one of the hardest parts to do, and I was a little lost on exactly how I wanted to make it. Now you can see I started out with a very basic structure, and the way I usually do this is by building up a square and then turning it into a circle. Now at this point, my plan wasn't to make a totally faithful recreation, and instead what I wanted to do was make a very basic structure. Part of that here was just building up the nose now, and while it didn't have the look I was going for, just for weight reasons, I wanted to make sure I had it in place there. Now I also went ahead and you can see I attached up the main body of the tail, and while it doesn't look perfect at the moment, it should work well for now. And giving this a test, well, it did fall down rather quickly. It's starting to move forward, which I guess is a good sign. With a few more braces on here though, I also decided to add on some wheels, and you can see now I got this starting to move across the ground. This isn't too bad at all, and the engines are actually doing a pretty good job at taxiing this around. It isn't going to get off the takeoff speed like this, but it's pretty close, and by just adding on some flying blocks here, I was hoping to push it right over the edge. This seemed to be pretty good, and just with a little bit of extra power, it really wasn't doing too bad at all. Now finally here, by rotating up the propellers to a more steep angle, it should let the plane get up to a much greater speed. This definitely seemed to be the case, and now by spinning up those flying blocks, this is starting to look really good. I was thinking if I added on some wings, I might even be able to take off. Before I do that though, there's one thing I wanted to do here, and you can see here I'm starting to add on a cover around the engines. Now I wanted to do this just to hide all the ugly mechanical components, and after rounding that all out here, you can see I finished it up, and now we're ready for the wings. Now this plane is a pretty distinct wing structure, and I wanted to make sure that I at least somewhat started to capture that. I spent a little while shaping everything and getting stuff to curve the way I wanted, but once I was mostly happy, you can see next I started to add on some extra panels to the front, and I curved them out to start to create that airfoil shape. Now I got the front finished up here, and you can see I did the same thing in the back where I just curved over the panels and got this nice little look. With that ready to go though, inside the plane I added some attachment points on, and you can see now I'm starting to add some wings inside the wings. The wing panels inside are actually going to be creating the lift, and everything on the outside is just for decoration purposes. Now once I was happy with how they looked though, you can see here I covered them back up, and with that I wanted to start working on the landing gear. Now putting a hard point on the bottom there, there, and after using some braces to hold the whole wing together, you can see here I added a log, put in a couple of wheels, and finally with that done, I copied the wing to the other side. Once I did this, I was really happy with the way that things looked, and I just need to add a few blocks on the inside here to make sure to hold it all together. And of course, use some braces just to keep the whole thing more rigid, but with all this done now, all I really had left to do was try to brace everything together. Now starting in the center of the plane, hopefully to keep the wings from falling off, and then I turned my attention to the engines, trying to keep them on the plane. With all that though, you can see now I'm trying to do a test in the air, and while the fuselage was a little weak here, everything else did seem mostly stable. Now turning my attention back to the fuselage, I actually decided to take off the nose and start over again. This time I wanted to actually shape the cockpit area, and you can see the way I'm doing that just by guiding on some panels. Now this is another one of those things of this plane that's relatively distinctive, so I wanted to make sure that I got the look right. Overall, once I had the skeleton built though, it was pretty simple to finish this up, but I did have to remember to leave a little gap in the nose of the plane, and for anyone who knows this plane well, you'll probably know the reason why. With the very front finish though, just had a few last panels to finish up, and I also made the back of this out of glass. Now with that, everything was looking pretty good, and I just made sure to finish that up and also add on some landing gear. It took a few tries to make sure it was all going to be rigid, but with all that in place now, I wanted to give it a test, and while it did look good, it was also very heavy at this point from all the extra panels I added on, and I was gonna have to do something about that. Now my first idea here was to try adding in a hot air balloon block to pull up the back of the plane. This should help out a lot, especially on takeoff, and with one of these in place, it wasn't doing bad, but I noticed the wings were sagging off the plane. With a couple of braces, it was looking a bit better, and at least in unbraking mode here, the plane was holding together. This was a great start, but to hopefully improve it a bit more, you can see I moved the hot air balloon block further back in the plane to get it more in line with the center of gravity. Now, once I got this braced up as good as I could, giving it another test now, it seemed to be working really well here, and at least taxiing across the ground, the engines were doing a good job. This is, of course, still in unbraking mode though, so once I turned that off now, things were looking a little bit worse. Overall, the plane actually wasn't doing too badly, but the hot air balloon block was ripping straight through the roof of the plane. My first idea here was just to use a few more braces to keep it from doing that. This did a pretty good job, but it still ended up ripping through a little bit later. Now, turning down its strength a bit more did actually fix that problem, and while a few panels were breaking, overall it actually wasn't too bad. The main issue seemed to be that the landing gear was totally collapsing in on itself, and after just making sure to brace it up in place, it was doing a lot better. There were still a few pieces of the plane that were breaking off, but these were relatively minor, and it wasn't stopping the plane from rolling across the ground. Now, I can see after not too long, made a few minor changes, and already nothing was breaking, and I figured I was ready to start taking off. Now, to do this, of course, I wanted to add back on those flying blocks, giving me a bit more power. These weren't doing too badly, and while I did get to nose up a little bit here without any control surfaces, it's a little difficult to control what's going on. I also noticed that the front of the plane was pretty heavy still, so to hopefully solve that, I added a hot air balloon block to do the same thing as the one in the back. And finally now, to control myself in the air, I added a hard point, and after that, I put in some wing panels. These, of course, are gonna let me pitch up and also roll side to side, and that should be all I need to move this plane. Now, giving this a quick run now, while one of them fell off almost immediately, I was able to pitch up the plane quite a bit here and barely start to get it off the ground. This probably would have been my first good flight if I didn't immediately just run into a mountain. Now that I was taking off though, I wanted to go back to the landing gear and try to fix the problem from before. Now if you remember, I just hard linked them in place so that they weren't able to fold up at all, which really wasn't what I was going for, and I tried a whole bunch of things here to keep them from bending back, but you can see they always end up breaking or just snapping off. Now I tried using suspension here to keep this all together, but no matter what I did, it still seemed to just break off, and I realized that there's still a little bit too much weight for this, so I decided just to keep them permanently linked in place. This looks a little goofy, but at the very least it works, and you can see now I'm actually going for my first successful flight. Now over these mountains here, it's actually not too uncontrollable, and while some panels were flying off, that's sort of par for the course whenever I have unbreakable mode off. I am missing one very important component of the plane though, and that's going to be the weapons. Now you can see here, I'm adding on some hard points to the wings, and on those I put down some decouplers, and on those I put down some rockets. I was hoping to have these work as very basic missiles, and once these were in place, I also decided to paint the plane. Now I see most of the pictures of the plane do have it in gray, but I really like the look of this green, so I decided to go with that instead. Once we were painted up though, I had the most important weapon to work on next, and that's going to be the front Gatling gun. Now of course, I can't really make a Gatling gun, but what I can do is add in a cannon and set it to fire very often. Now I actually thought this had a pretty good look to it, and after changing my missiles from rockets to being cannons, with this, that's the final plane. Now I want to take this for a test flight here and just talk a little bit about it. One thing is that taking off off the ground is a little awkward, and I think part of that is since I'm using the hot air balloons, it kind of throws off the mass a lot. Once it's off though, it's able to fly pretty well, and overall, this thing's quite maneuverable. Theoretically, if I added some sort of variable pitch on the engines, I probably would be able to get up to a lot higher speed, but honestly, this is not doing too bad at all, and while it definitely doesn't look exactly like the real thing, I think it's a pretty good recreation of Besiege. But guys, if you want to see any more content like this, make sure to subscribe. If you got any more comments or build ideas, make sure to leave them down in the comments below. And otherwise, till next time.